Good evening and welcome. My name is Michaela Broomberg. I'm the head of programme at the Royal Society of Literature. This evening's event is a collaboration between the Royal Society of Literature and the British Library, which houses the original manuscript of Virginia Woolf's novel, originally titled The Hours. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about something coming up at the British Library, which is that next week, on Thursday the 26th of June, there's an exciting new series starting here called Write Back. What do writers talk about when they're not writing? It will include Noor Al-Sadir, Nikesh Shukla, and Claire Louise Bennett, along with Helen Mort. And you can book online at the British Library, go to What's On, and then Literature. A little bit complicated, but I hear completely worth it. Okay. So, as for tonight, here we are on a Wednesday in mid-June. 10 years ago, literary critic and RSL fellow Elaine Showalter, along with some other RSL fellows who are here tonight, called for the creation of an annual Dalloway Day in London to celebrate this modernist masterpiece in the same way that Bloomsday is marked each year in Dublin. She says, "This is a date worth celebrating. It should be the occasion of readings, exhibitions, performances, and revelry." The RSL has been doing this ever since, and this year has been a particularly special celebration as we mark 100 years since the book's original publication. The first publication was for only 2,000 copies, and it has remained in print ever since. Mrs Dalloway is a clarion call to pay attention to the everyday. Its structure amplifies the pain and the beauty of being alive, peeling back the layers of a single, seemingly ordinary day, slipping in and out of different characters' perspectives. Taking place on a Wednesday in mid-June 1923, as Clarissa Dalloway prepares for a party she'll throw that evening. It captures the dazzling brilliance and breathtaking pain wrapped up in just being alive when you're awake to it. Tonight, we've assembled an incredible panel who have each read the novel closely and reframed it brilliantly in their own ways. It will be moderated by Bidisha Mamata. Bidisha is a broadcaster, presenter, and journalist on screen, mic, film, page, and stage. She writes for the main UK broadsheets. Currently, she's a critic and columnist for The Observer and The Guardian. And she chairs events and features extensively across BBC TV and radio, CNN, Channel 5, and Sky News. Her fifth book is Asylum and Exile, Hidden Voices of London, and her most recent publication is the essay The Future of Serious Art. I will let Bidisha introduce our incredible panelists and special guests for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Michaela. And hello, everyone, and welcome to this event presented by the Royal Society of Literature, A Century of Mrs Dalloway. And indeed, the draft manuscripts of Virginia Woolf's famous novel can be found here at the British Library. We are so honoured to welcome our panel to celebrate and discuss Mrs Dalloway and all things Woolf. We will be offering discussion and performances from the novel. And in the last 15 minutes, we would love to hear your questions. We do say this at every event. Please keep it brief, keep it respectful, and do frame it as a question rather than a comment, just so that the panel have something to really get their teeth stuck into so we can answer you as best we can. And Hatchards have got a lovely bookstall outside. You can pick up a new edition of Mrs Dalloway, as well as books by our panelists. We have on stage with us tonight Merve Emre, Professor of Creative Writing and Criticism at Wesleyan University and the Director of the Shapiro Center for Creative Writing and Criticism. Her many books include the Ferrante Letters and, most aptly for us tonight, the annotated Mrs Dalloway. We have Phelim McDermott, a founder member of Improbable Theatre and the recipient of many honours, including an Olivier and a Critics' Circle Award. For the Metropolitan Opera in New York, he adapted Michael Cunningham's novel, The Hours, which was an evocation of and a tribute to the life and work of Virginia Woolf. And we also welcome Helen Tennyson, award-winning director and theatre maker who brings us right up to date with her stage adaptation of Mrs Dalloway. It just completed a run at the London Library and is now in Oxford opening tomorrow and playing until Sunday, the 22nd of June. Produced by Creation Theatre. There are 1 or 2 tickets left. It's only an hour away by train, so just a quick little plug there. And we may not or may not have an extremely special and eminent guest joining us, but we'll see about that. From the production of Mrs. Dalloway, we are so lucky and excited to have not one, but all 3 Mrs. Dalloways with us here tonight, performing excerpts. Tracy Bargate, Julie Cheung-inhin, and Lucinda Lloyd. So we will be peppering our discussion with some beautiful readings from the novel. Without further ado, let me start with you, Merve Emre. What for you as a reader are the most powerful themes and salient motifs of Mrs. Dalloway?
Oh, a small question.
Just a tiny one.
I was thinking about how one of my favorite diary entries in Virginia Woolf's diary is after she publishes Jacob's Room, and she thinks about her husband Leonard's criticism of that novel, and she writes, he says that it has no philosophy of life, and the next novel I write will have to have a philosophy of life in it. So what does it mean to have a philosophy of life? One of my favorite moments in the novel is when Clarissa and Peter are speaking to each other. She's mending her dress. He's playing with that pocket knife of his that he can't quite let go of. And she thinks about when they were by the lake as children. And she remembers walking up to her parents by the lake. And she thinks now she had in her hands a whole life. She wanted to give them her whole life. What does it mean to have a philosophy of life? It means to look back on the days, the hours, the memorable scenes in one's life, and in looking back, in remembering, in excavating oneself, try to create something complete. So for me, that philosophy of life is paired in this novel with a philosophy or a general ambiance of death. And so it is maybe a cop-out to say life and death are the 2 great themes of this novel, because what novel are those not the themes of? But I think that's a pretty good place to start.
I'm going to take what you say, because I love what you say about remembrance and memory. So what happens between life and death, all of our experiences, but all of our recollections as well. Phelim, I'm going to come to you in just a moment, because we're going to talk about Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway as seen through the eyes of Michael Cunningham. But I just want to bring this to Helen Tennyson, because we have our performers here tonight. But what is it that you see when you look at Mrs. Dalloway? You're having to excavate the text for what will connect with people.
Yeah, there's so much in there. But interestingly, what you're saying about the themes and life and death, I feel like it's very much how do we reconcile ourselves with our mortality? And certainly what is that reconciliation that comes about in middle age when you start to look back on the paths you've taken and the life that you've led, and you have this awareness of the limited time that is left. So how do we live with the choices that we've made? How do we live with the fact that people die, that we might die? How do we choose to live every day? So I think even though it's about life and death, and it's about death, it's really hopeful, because Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa, does keep choosing life. So when I was looking at those themes, it was very much about that choice, and that, I mean, it's very Virginia Woolf, but that sense of the waves of feeling the despair and then making the choice again to live.
And I love what you say about the sliding doors element of it, that even though we see this story as playing out within one day, it's actually about alternative paths and the shadows of, path B or C that we could have taken. We'll come back to all of these later in the discussion, but Phelim, I'm really aware that you were looking at Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway through the prism of Michael Cunningham and also through the prism of opera and performance. What did you perceive of her and it, as in Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway, through Michael Cunningham?
There's been an interesting journey with... So, of course, I was asked to direct this opera, which had been written Of course, I read Mrs. Dalloway, and then I read The Hours, and then I put the opera on. And it's been interesting to respond to this event by going back and looking at Mrs. Dalloway. So the first impression is like, wow, this is so dense and it's so amazing. But I feel like because I've had the opportunity to work with performers and singers, one of the things about that world is you engage with time, and how time is a very strange and wonderful thing, because it isn't linear. And especially in opera, you're having these moments where time is vertical. So you have these moments where people stop and they sing, and time is kind of suspended. So for me, what I'm amazed by in the book is this exploration of the interiority of it all. So one little moment has all this depth to it vertically. There's what's going on out here in interactions, but there's also what's going on inside. There's what is happening, what didn't happen. And so the book layers these things again and again and again, as the opera and The Hours itself explores as well in response to that book. But it's so basically I'm saying you can go back again and again to that book.
The reason
and see it differently every time because of that.
The reason I'm smiling is because, like a true professional,
Yeah.
you have given me the in-line, because we have a beautiful excerpt from those very famous opening moments of Mrs. Dalloway. So thank you very much for that. But also let us welcome Lucinda Lloyd to the stage.
Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, for Lucy had her work cut out for her. The doors would be taken off their hinges. Rumpelmeyer's men were coming. And then, thought Clarissa Dalloway, what a morning, fresh as if issued to children on a beach. What a lark, what a plunge. For so it had always seemed to her when, with a little squeak of the hinges, which she could hear now, she had burst open the French windows and plunged at Bourton into the open air. How fresh, how calm. Stiller than this, of course, the air was in the early morning, like the flap of a wave, the kiss of a wave. Chill and sharp, and yet, for a girl of 18, as then she was, solemn, feeling as she did, standing there at the open window, that something awful was about to happen. Looking at the flowers, at the trees with the smoke winding off them, and the rooks rising, falling, standing and looking until Peter Walsh said, musing among the vegetables, was that it? I prefer men to cauliflowers. Was that it? He must have said it at breakfast one morning when she had gone out onto the terrace. Peter Walsh. He would be back from India one of these days, June or July, she forgot which, for his letters were awfully dull. It was his sayings one remembered. His eyes, his pocket knife, his smile, his grumpiness, and, when millions of things had utterly vanished, how strange it was. A few sayings like this about cabbages. For having lived in Westminster, how many years now? Over 20. One feels, even in the midst of the traffic, or waking at night, Clarissa was positive, a particular hush, a solemnity, an indescribable pause, a suspense. But that might be her heart, affected, they said, by influenza. Before Big Ben strikes, there, out it boomed. First a warning, musical, then the hour, irrevocable. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. Such fools we are, she thought, crossing Victoria Street. For heaven only knows why one loves it so, how one sees it so, making it up, building it round one, tumbling it, creating it every moment afresh. But the veriest frumps, the most dejected of miseries sitting on doorsteps, drink their downfall, do the same. Can't be dealt with, she felt positive, by Acts of Parliament, for that very reason. They love life. In people's eyes, in the swing, tramp and trudge, in the bellow and the uproar, the carriages, motor cars, omnibuses, vans, sandwich men, shuffling and swinging, brass, bands, barrel organs, in the triumph and the jingle and the strange high singing of some aeroplane overhead was what she loved. Life. London. This moment of June.
So very much for that, Lucinda Lloyd, reading from the very famous opening pages of Mrs. Dalloway. Helen, let me bring you in here. As is immediately obvious from those opening words, the setting and the pace of the novel, they're so important, they're so immediate. Is this a great London novel, a great walking novel, a great communing with the wider community novel?
Oh, I think it's definitely a walking novel. Absolutely. And actually, when I started adapting it, I was listening to an audio version of the novel and doing lots and lots of walking coming out of the pandemic. And there is something about the rhythm of the language, all those clauses within the sentences and that structure that really seemed to flow with walking for me. And also the interior monologue. When we walk, we think. And there's, like you were saying, the interior world of Mrs. Dalloway. It's there. It's an internal thought as you're walking. And that's actually a very big part of that's what I've tried to capture in the adaptation, but maybe that's for later.
We can talk about it a little bit now, just in the sense of the paradox of Virginia Woolf herself, who was often represented, in fact, slightly misrepresented in the film adaptation of The Hours as being a little bit sort of listless and lackluster. And actually, that's not what comes across in the prose, particularly in this novel. She comes across as restless, as energetic, as having lots and lots of thoughts and calories and ideas to burn.
Yes, I mean, Clarissa Dalloway has this external character that's often described as cold and repressed in some ways, and then her internal world is just, what I love about it is it's flying all over the place, or these waves of joy, of insecurity, and I find it very reassuring, because I feel like my own internal monologue, I'm sure lots of people's internal monologues just goes on and on and on and on, and I think that's one of the joys of the book, and certainly in the adaptation, that for me was the key thing that we have to capture, is how do I give that experience to an audience? Because when you're reading a book, you're there with it, and for me, the audio in the ears was a key thing about the internal monologue. It was like, wow, her thoughts are really in my head while I'm listening and walking. So as part of the production, the audience also go on a walk.
In reality.
Yes, our production.
Yes, in your actual production,
yes.
We sort of walk and talk and think and feel.
Yes.
With you and with Clarissa.
Yes.
And with Virginia Woolf.
Yeah.
Phelim, I want to bring you in here and talk a little bit about purity and about getting back to the essence of a text, because we are talking here about an incredibly famous, world-renowned author, a world-renowned book. How do you bring it down to brass tacks in the best possible way, nailing the essence of it?
Do you mean in like staging it, or?
Yes, because Helen was talking about, and in fact you mentioned at the beginning, you started by rereading the book. Even before you got to The Hours, you got to Mrs. Dalloway.
Well, I mean, I think one of the difficulties of going from a novel to an adaptation or to an opera is that you have to reduce. So you're trying to keep the essence and the purity of what that is if you then turn it into something that's living. So you end up using things like music, and you end up, in our production we used the dancers to express the inner life and that connects the characters in the opera. So you have to use, you don't have the time that's within a novel where someone sits on their own and you can take their time. You're trying to, kind of communicate the sophistication of all those different levels when you're staging. So we were very lucky. We had some very beautiful music, and so you're going from different mediums. What's amazing, I think, about the book is it's an invitation. So an invitation to see the world differently. It's an invitation to recognize your own craziness, or not see yourself as crazy because you go, oh. So even this day I was walking along the street, and you look at people and you go, there's an inner monologue going on there that's just as complicated and as rich as... So there's something radical in that book of almost, I imagine at the time, taboo about including all those things. So I don't think it's about, in a way, it's not about purity. It's about the opposite. It's about including all the impurity.
I like
impurity of all the stuff that goes on in a moment.
Yeah.
There's a surface level of the conversations that you have at the party. But inside Mrs. Dalloway is all this stuff going on. Yeah. And she's also imagining, what is that going on in other people?
I love what you say about dilatoriness and dissolution. It brings me to a much darker element of the novel. So people often remember Mrs. Dalloway as, it's a novel about a woman throwing a party. And in fact, that's only a small part of it. I wondered, Merve Emre, if we could bring you in here and talk about an incredibly dark theme, which is about the post-war society, about shell shock, about PTSD, about many of the characters feeling the draw to life, as we've mentioned, but also suicidality and depression.
Well, sorry, Lucinda, I just want to compliment you on that reading, because that was so beautiful. And for those of you who are listening to it closely, of course you hear the energy, the life, you hear the music. It's a deeply musical novel in its own right. There's somebody singing, there's a barrel organ playing, she's remembering hearing Wagner. So all of that is built into it, but when you were listening to that section that Lucinda read, you also probably heard the reference to influenza, that Clarissa's heart is weak after a bout of influenza. A little bit after that section that you read, her neighbor, Scrope Purvis, sees her on the curb, and he thinks she had grown very white since her illness. So already in the midst of all the energy, all the fizz of that language, you have the specter of the Spanish influenza, which killed more people than trench warfare did. And then, of course, what you have is the creation of Septimus Smith, the other character, the double of Clarissa, who will appear a little bit later on in the novel. Shell-shocked soldier also wandering around London with his wife, and talk about music, hearing the birds singing to him in Greek. And so you have these, two pairings, a philosophy of life and a philosophy of death. And what's also just very important to flag is that the philosophy of death here is deeply political, as is the philosophy of life. It's a great walking novel. At the same time, it's a novel that shows you how the history of empire is inscribed on every street corner of this city, that you cannot walk around it without seeing a monument to someone who committed horrific atrocities in some other part of the world. And you cannot read this novel without thinking about the fact that within it, some people's lives are expendable. And some people's forms of madness can be glorified, can be rarefied, and other people's forms of madness are to be treated and suppressed. And so behind this story of, a woman throwing a party is a long and deep and profound critique of empire and how that fixes the categories of life and death for us.
I want to take on that very serious point and bring it to Helen and Phelim about the dangers of uncritically celebrating something as if it's preserved in amber. Is it also the case that sometimes you read something which was celebrated for a very long time and actually there are certain dead notes in it and there are certain things that you think, this was accepted as normal for a very long time and now it just hits a little bit different? Helen, if I come to you and then Phelim to you.
I think that's a very good question, and I think I ask that every time I stage some sort of classic. So I do a lot of Shakespeare and I do a lot of adapting classic novels. And I think the question is always, how do I examine that? Can I examine that within the production? Is there scope to do that? Is there scope to reframe it, question it, interrogate it within the production? Or do I cut that because it's offensive? and there's always so I think it's very important to be very conscious of how these things, of the messages they're giving out, and interrogate them and not just go, here it is. Yeah.
What about the right to be offensive? I mean, or at least to say to an audience, right, this is going to be confronting. You may well not agree with this, that, and the other, but...
I suppose I feel that I, as a creative, that I have a responsibility not to put something out into the world that I think reaffirms opinions or perspectives that I think...
Or that just hurts others in a gratuitous way. Phelim, I want to put the same question to you.
I think this character of Septimus is, well, there's a couple of things. Septimus is interesting because he, as we say, we would now call it PTSD.
PTSD.
I remember growing up, my grandma would talk about her husband being shell-shocked, And we have different attitudes to what I would call extreme states, They're states that are pathologized and institutionalized, but actually in that novel you see Woolf has this awareness of there is something in this extreme state that he's embodying. He's a marginalized voice, it's a marginalized story of what happened. So the sort of social constructs around that story are of that time, but actually it's radically forward thinking, I think, in its awareness. And then she's haunted by his death and hears it at the party. So there's this, again, a real extraordinary thing of like the social party where we don't worry about this, but actually she finds something that shifts in herself when she acknowledges that this person that she's seen but doesn't understand has this profound impact on her, and there is something transformative in that. So the suicide, you can see, I imagine, Woolf discussing her own death wish impulses, and then, this opera, The Hours, all the characters are haunted by Virginia Woolf's suicide. So it feels like that they are taboo subjects, but I find that the opportunity to look at those things through art is an incredibly valuable thing. So I think one, in the bigger picture of it all, the things that one might go, we don't do that now, we don't say that now, that for me is kind of like, if you go into that work and really explore it, you see how deep the examination is of what she's looking at.
But I also really take your point that, in fact, it's very lazy and easy to think that Clarissa is the avatar for Virginia Woolf, whereas in actual fact it may well be the soldier who kills himself.
Or there are aspects of herself,
Merve.
Well, this is part of the philosophy of life or the philosophy of art that's articulated so powerfully in this novel. There's that moment, actually we're going to hear it, I think.
We are going to.
Well, there are two moments. One is at the beginning when Clarissa thinks about how her life is kind of scattered through the trees and through all of the people that she meets, and then we're going to hear the moment on the omnibus where a very similar, almost transcendental thought repeats. And of course, that's what writing is. One does not put oneself into any particular character. You are everywhere. You are everywhere. And so part of the philosophy of life of this novel is that it actually contains the life of the novelist, but dispersed and democratic. And what I love about the section that we just heard Lucinda read is, you're right, she's walking and she's thinking about her own interiority and plumbing the depths of that, but she's also thinking that the tramps on the street have an equally complex interior life. And it's for that reason that in his final chapter of his extraordinary study, Mimesis, Eric Auerbach identifies Virginia Woolf as giving full articulation to the democratic possibility of every person's life being worth examining, worth plumbing those depths, not just a sort of posh lady throwing a party, but everybody, whether they're pathologized, whether they're on the street, no matter how uninteresting they are, whether they're just an old woman sitting on a train car, as she writes about in her phenomenal essay on character. But that democratic sensibility, that commitment to the democratization of life is everywhere in a novel that is also viciously critiquing the way that life, when put into the hands of an imperial government, is only given to certain people.
You've set up the perfect
I know.
moment in which I know.
You're welcome.
Which I think we would love to hear. We've set this out so we've got a reading from the beginning, the middle, and the closing moments of Mrs. Dalloway. But I think that we would love to hear from Julie Cheung-inhin reading from Mrs. Dalloway.
Clarissa once, going on top of an omnibus with him somewhere, Clarissa, superficially at least, so easily moved, now in despair, now in the best of spirits, all a quiver in those days, and such good company, spotting queer little scenes, names, people from the top of a bus, for they used to explore London and bring back bags full of treasures from the Caledonian market. Clarissa had a theory in those days. They had heaps of theories, always theories, as young people have. It was to explain the feeling they had of dissatisfaction, not knowing people, not being known. For how could they know each other? You met every day, then not for 6 months or years. It was unsatisfactory, they agreed, how little one knew people. But, she said, sitting on the bus going up Shaftesbury Avenue, she felt herself everywhere. Not here, 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 and she tapped the back of the seat, but everywhere. She waved her hand, going up Shaftesbury Avenue. She was all that. So that to know her, or anyone, one must seek out the people who completed them, even the places. Odd affinities she had with people she had never spoken to. Some woman in the street, some man behind a counter, even trees or barns. It ended in a transcendental theory, which, with her horror of death, allowed her to believe, or say that she believed, for all her skepticism, that since our apparitions, the part of us which appears, are so momentary compared with the other, the unseen part of us, which spreads wide, the unseen might survive, be recovered somehow, attached to this person or that, or even haunting certain places after death. Perhaps. Looking back over that long friendship of almost 30 years, her theory worked to this extent. Brief, broken, often painful as their actual meetings had been, what with his absences and interruptions. This morning, for instance, in came Elizabeth, like a long-legged colt, handsome, dumb, just as he was beginning to talk to Clarissa. The effect of them on his life was immeasurable. There was a mystery about it. You were given a sharp, acute, uncomfortable grain, the actual meeting, horribly painful as often as not. Yet in absence, in the most unlikely places, it would flower out, open, shed its scent, let you touch, taste, look about you, get the whole feel of it and understanding after years of lying lost. She had influenced him more than any person he had ever known. And always, in this way, coming before him without his wishing it, cool, ladylike, critical, or ravishing, romantic, recalling some field or English harvest. He saw her most often in the country, not in London, one scene after another at Boughton.
Thank you so very much to Julie Cheung-inhin reading from the central section, all very well-known passages from Mrs. Dalloway, and what we just heard leads us right into a question I have about sort of gender and sexuality and performativity. It's one for everyone really here. The central character is, at least on the surface, a paragon of respectability and convention and charm. She's conventionally attractive, she behaves nicely, no one has bad things to say about her. Is there a more complex reality, more complex drives behind this notion of the good woman in society? If I start with you, Helen.
I mean, certainly with Clarissa, yes, definitely. We're very quickly introduced to all the choices that she's made in order to become this good woman. When she talks about her marriage and having chosen Richard above Peter, it's very clear that that's for safety and security. And also we're very quickly introduced to this intense love that she had for Sally Seton in her youth. And it's very clear when she talks about her sort of sensuality that the affection for Sally Seton moved her to a far greater depth than anything she's ever experienced.
What a great bunch of euphemisms, Helen.
Than anything she's experienced for Richard, right? Yeah. So she's definitely more complex in that way. And I guess, in that time period, obviously, to choose to be in a lesbian relationship or whatever wasn't really an option for a woman of her class, I know. And obviously that's something that we can talk about with Virginia Woolf's own life and how she obviously was living some of these questions and choices. And it's very difficult not to sort of make that comparison there. But of course, Clarissa is far more upper class than Virginia Woolf. So there's that complexity, and there's a sort of hint of more radical politics in her youth as well.
She's also much more externally conventional than Virginia Woolf ever was.
Yeah, in so many ways.
And also, I think, including the other characters and her friendships. And she's really the kind of...
Yes.
The woman who's following all the rules on the surface, at least, which Virginia did not do.
And I think that's part of the joy of it, is that big contrast between on the surface she is so proper, and then but this huge, rich sort of TARDIS-like existence on the inside. I think that's the joy of it.
Phelim, I want to bring you in here because Michael Cunningham's The Hours complicates all of that and adds in further layers because it's also his way of looking at Virginia Woolf, but also women from his era of writing, and yet the same issues, the same questions remain. Who made the rule about what it takes to be a good woman in society and to be seen as morally good, and who decides who the bad, rule-breaking woman is?
I mean, it's interesting because I feel like The Hours, and even in its title, it's the original title for Mrs. Dalloway, so it's almost right from the start saying this is like an alternate, a parallel universe, an alternate version a response, a rhyme in the future. And the social constraints are different. So our Clarissa in the Hours is living with Sally, but her unlived life is with other. So the gender and the sexuality is kind of like, I guess he's in some way saying you might get a different freedoms, but even within that, you're going to have social constraints that echo forward in time. So yeah, it's kind of, I think anyone who's not read The Hours, it's a beautiful thing to go from The Hours to Mrs. Dalloway and see the responses, because there's a mirror there. So there's key moments that are exactly the same. There's a kiss, there's a meeting on a street, but the characters are different, but they're the same. So it's like a beautiful parallel universe. And I kind of found myself going, well, read The Hours. Is it, I have real respect for what he did in that book, because you can see it's actually, the whole book is it's a prayer to Mrs. Dalloway. And I was thinking about that question of how you adapt Mrs. Dalloway. My thought would be, no, you don't do it, because it's too intimidating. But you can see he went, I will not forget that. I will, honor it and create some art from that. And then in that book, it's sort of saying that's our kind of thing that might save us is to keep making art whilst not forgetting the art that's inspired us,
I just want to circle back, because on the one hand, we talk about, in a very Woolfian way, kind of moving forward, but also about circling back. And I do still think that question around gender and sexuality and gender performance, really. I mean, Clarissa Dalloway, to me, Merve, is publicly playing the role of the nice lady, with all this stuff boiling underneath the surface.
I was actually thinking about how the only heterosexual kiss in Woolf's entire oeuvre is in The Voyage Out. And some of you will remember this. It's when Richard Dalloway, who's also a character in that novel, forces himself on the young woman who's the main character of The Voyage Out. It's the only heterosexual kiss that Virginia Woolf ever writes, and it is a scene of assault. And of course, many of you probably know that Clarissa Dalloway started her life in The Voyage Out, and in The Voyage Out, she is presented as that tinselly, hard, glittering character that Woolf worried that she was, and felt that she had to bring innumerable other characters to her assistance. But of course, the kiss with Sally Seton, which is really just a kind of, kind of euphemistic orgasm scene, right, is the exact opposite of that forced heterosexual kiss in The Voyage Out. And it becomes a way of giving her an erotic life, a sensual life, a youth that she was denied in The Voyage Out. So I think another way in which we go back while going forward is thinking, here's a character that I created and I didn't do her justice. I treated her in a particularly flat or uninteresting way, and I have some kind of responsibility, or I have some kind of desire to do more. I just want to say one thing about what you said about marriage, which is that it's interesting. I don't actually think she chooses Richard because he's safe or secure, or because she wants to be good. She has this amazing moment where she thinks of Peter. He would have wanted too much of her. And I think we do sometimes make these choices. We do not choose the person who makes us feel intensely, because that's a lot and it's painful in its way. That pleasure is painful. And so she chooses the person who will bring her flowers but won't say that he loves her. She chooses the person who will not want too much of her interiority, because that interiority can get preserved, so that when she climbs up to her attic room and thinks about how she failed Richard, she can't respond to him sexually, there's something she's preserving, and it's the memory of that youth. It's the memory of that intensity, and that's hers. It doesn't have to be shared in the context of a marriage. And that's so interesting to me because it's not just being conventional, it's insisting on a kind of private pleasure that I love.
I've got to jump in, and I totally agree that that privacy is so important to her, and I think a fascinating aspect of her character, and that I feel like that's part of sort of, maybe safety is not the right word, but that's part of this. That is the secure choice.
Right.
And part of the risk or the difficulty of Peter was that he was continually coming into this interior world, and she wants to keep that for herself.
I mean, he's an insufferable character in so many many ways. But everybody has one of those, right, in their background somewhere. Yeah.
Well, to what extent?
Sometimes you have many in your background somewhere. Yeah.
To what extent is this? Could Mrs. Dalloway be read actually as a tragedy? I mean, the scene where she goes up the stairs to her lesbian fortress of solitude, and you go, oh great, so this is what you got at the end of all of that. You threw this party for this guy, your ex-girlfriend showed up, and then you went to bed in your single bed by yourself after doing all of this work.
I mean, that sounds like a triumph. What are you talking about? A tragedy? But I just read in my attic, so I don't.
Right, exactly.
But I mean, it's an. May I? Sorry,
Yeah,
I
go for it.
I mean, it's an elegy in many ways. You think about that party, which is such an extraordinary scene, but the way that the people in it are described are as mummified. Aunt Perry shows up and everyone thinks she's dead, but she's actually there, right? Sally Seton has 5 boys who went to Eton, and oh my God, what a desire killer, right? When she sees her, she's like gained weight, and she has 5 children who went to Eton, like that's done, right? And so the fact that even in the midst of all that death and kind of the end of the empire, right? It's also an elegy for a particular version of the empire. In the middle of all that personal and political death, she can still climb up to that attic room and feel something, feel the beauty, feel the fun. I don't read that. I don't read that tragically. I don't know. Maybe you two feel differently. Like I said, I just read in my attic, so
well,
I don't.
I just want to bring this on home for a second. Helen, the novel is slim, but as is very obvious, it contains so many of the alternatives and parallel dimensions that Phelan mentioned that we could talk about what would have happened if character A, B, or C had done C, D, E, or F endlessly. Is there a sense in which the characters, all of the characters, are actually contemplating paths that they could have taken, and that's, in a sense, yes, it's the source of their rapture, but it's also something to do with being of a certain age and stage in life. It's also the source of their sorrow.
Yeah, they're all, I think, comes back to sort of what I said at the beginning about the thing that I love about it is how do we reconcile with the paths we've taken? You reach a certain point where you're like, well, I've taken these paths, and oh my goodness, now I'm of an age where I don't have the ability to go, the world is my oyster, I can take multiple paths. So there's a lot of, reflecting back on that, but I still find it hopeful. Like there's a pathos in that. It's sad to say, oh, I've lived that bit now, and this is the choice I've made, and this is the result. But there's something in it, and I think it is within the character of Clarissa that just, or maybe it's just in Virginia Woolf's recognizing of that I find incredibly comforting and sort of okay. Like, it's okay. We all hit middle age and go, oh, this is my life then. And that's okay. Like, it's sort of positive, but not in a way party positive, just in a like, oh, I accept that
it's
this
positive,
is me.
But not in a celebratory or
So,
happy-making way.
for me, what that's about, what I feel behind it is a sense of her compassion.
Yeah.
So she has a compassion for her own, oh, it could have been this. She has a compassion for how it wasn't that. And she has a compassion for, as you say, in a kind of democratic way, for not just the different characters, but for all the different stories. And that's what's sort of kind of beautiful about it, because it's so complex. All the different stories that could have happened, all the different, life is so complex. Just walking across a park, you go, oh my God, they're so, but she has a compassion which opens up to the wonderful complexity of it all. Things don't work out, but there is a bigger pattern. And you can see in that writing that she's seeing this complex pattern in life and our lives. And it's very, very ordinary, very, very simple. Simultaneously, it's epic and mythic. And as you say, there's a tragic story there, but there's also the other side of that story. So I feel like what her beauty is to be like an elder who holds it all and goes, yeah, this is what our lives are like. It may look ordinary from over here, that life, but actually inside that person, it's mythic and epic, and it's this. And there's also mythic and epic stories about empire and what's happening in this city and what it was built on. So that's, I don't know, that's kind of like mind-blowing to me.
In a few moments... No.
No. Well, I was just going to walk back my own democratic reading and say, I just wanted to point out the servants don't get interiority.
I was just going to. I was
Neither
going to
do
say
the Irish.
That,
so just while we're
Maybe
let me just qualify. I just wanted to
maybe
throw
in
that
6 months' time, just before Christmas, we could do an anti-Dalloway day where we just pick the entire book.
Well, that's called
shreds.
Bloomsday. I was just in Dublin for that, so we get that there, and that's just filth, you know.
Just pick it to shreds. In the closing moments of our discussion, we're going to open this all out and look at next steps and where readers can go from here. But I think that I would really love to hear an extract from the closing moments of Mrs. Dalloway, read for us by Tracy Bargate.
Lady Bradshaw murmured how, just as we were starting, my husband was called up on the telephone. A very sad case. A young man has killed himself. He had been in the army. Oh, thought Clarissa. In the middle of my party, here's death, she thought. What business had the Bradshaws to talk of death at her party? A young man had killed himself. He had thrown himself from a window. Up had flashed the ground. Through him, blundering, bruising, went the rusty spikes. So she saw it. She had once thrown a shilling into the Serpentine. Never anything more, but he had flung it away. They went on living. She would have to go back. The rooms were still crowded. People kept on coming. They would grow old. A thing there was that mattered. A thing wreathed about with chatter, defaced, obscured in her own life, let drop every day in corruption lies chatter. This he had preserved. Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate. People feeling the impossibility of reaching the centre, which mystically evaded them. Closeness drew apart, rapture faded, one was alone. There was an embrace in death. Then, she had felt it only this morning, there was the terror. The overwhelming incapacity, one's parents giving it into one's hands, this life to be lived to the end, to be walked with serenely. There was in the depths of her heart an awful fear. Somehow it was her disaster, her disgrace. It was her punishment to see sink and disappear here a man, there a woman. In this profound darkness, and she forced to stand there in her evening dress. She had schemed, she had pilfered, she was never wholly admirable. She had wanted success, Lady Bexborough and the rest of it. And once she had walked the terrace at Bourton. It was due to Richard. She had never been so happy. Nothing could be slow enough, nothing last too long. No pleasure could be equal, she thought, straightening the chairs, pushing in one book on the shelf. This having done with the triumphs of youth, lost herself in the process of living to find it with a shot of delight as the sun rose, as the day sank. Fear no more the heat of the sun. She must go back to them. But what an extraordinary night. She felt somehow very like him, the young man who had killed himself. She felt glad that he had done it, thrown it away. The clock was striking. The leaden circles dissolved in the air. He made her feel the beauty, made her feel the fun. But she must go back. She must assemble. She must find Sally and Peter.
Thank you so very much indeed. Tracy Bargate reading from that famous moment that we were just discussing from the party scene, that moment of reflection and looking back and forward simultaneously. In a few moments, we are going to open up to questions from the floor, so have a think about what you'd like to ask our panel. We have covered so very much. Moving forward, most people encounter Mrs. Dalloway during their A-level years or their undergraduate. Does the experience of rereading the novel or reading it change according to where you yourself are at in life? And have you had any of those rereading moments with Mrs. Dalloway? Who would like to answer first?
I can start. God, I want to take the three of you home with me.
I
Just
know.
have you, read
Those beautiful,
as I'm falling asleep.
those silvery voices,
so lovely.
so great.
Oh, it's so nice. I read it for the first time when I was like 12 or 13 with a friend, very good friend still, and he and I used to just exchange books to read all the time back when children used to do that. And I found this letter that he had sent me. I must have been at camp or away or something, I don't remember. But he sent me a letter. I must have sent him a letter first that said, "You have to read Mrs. Dalloway because I think we are Peter and Clarissa." And I found this letter in my parents' attic that he sent back to me, and he said, "We are not Peter and Clarissa. We are Jake Barnes and Lady Brett Ashley from The Sun Also Rises by one Ernest Hemingway." And then he wrote, "But read it all the way through to the end so you understand what I mean." So my first experience of reading it was
Your
very,
friend
very
sounds
young.
terrible. Your friend sounds like a drag, Merve.
He's totally great, and a banker now. Did not see through this potentially illustrious career as a literary critic. But I remember reading it so young, and of course not understanding anything about it. I teach it almost every year now in a class that I teach on how to read novels, and the way that I teach the novels that I teach in that class is I actually buy all the novels for my students and I send them to the print shop and I have them reverse serialized. So I cut up Middlemarch into 8 books and I hand them out as installments. I cut up Dalloway into 12 sections and I hand it out in installments. And one of the things that doing that has taught me is what a profoundly imperfect and deeply weird novel this novel is. I mean, the 12 hours are so disproportionate. And in fact, those of you who've read it recently will remember the kind of tirade against proportion that we get about halfway through this novel. There's that bizarre solitary traveler dream sequence, which almost reads like a kind of Lukácsian critique of the novel in the novel itself. It's so uneven, it's so weird. Despite how schematic its organization seems from the outset, it is messy and wild and all over the place. And compared to it, something like Orlando or even To the Lighthouse seems much tamer. So I think my experience of reading it and teaching it over and over again is to really, really appreciate how odd and imperfect and angular and deeply strange of a novel it is.
I love that you mentioned Orlando, because apart from the central, there's a whole other event to be done on Orlando. Which
I'm doing an annotated Orlando right now, so
Brilliant.
I'm very,
Yeah.
very into Orlando.
But
right
your
now.
point that actually it's really quite a conventional, structurally conventional narrative. Apart from the central conceit,
Right.
what you see is what you get with it. But that is TBD.
romance. It's
That is to be discussed at a later date. But Phelim, the notion of reading and rereading and embracing and re-embracing.
You know, as I read it late, because I read it because I was going to do the hours. I hadn't read it as a youngster. My mum was an English teacher and was a big Virginia Woolf fan, so maybe that's why I have, why it's happened late. But even in this time of reading it before and after doing the show, what's interesting about it, this week, of course, I've been revisiting it because of this discussion. What I find is that, you know, the wonderful thing about time travel that can happen with literature. I can remember, in reading the book, I remember where I was the first time I read. So that feels to me like a rhyme with what the book's about. If you hear it on an audio book as you're walking, you walk down and I go, oh, this is the bit where I heard this bit. So I love that invitation that's in that book. But that's also an invitation for me to go back to when I was younger and remember how I saw life then. But also that thing of like, it opens your eyes again as you walk to what's, rather than just walking down the street, getting to the station, you are invited to look at the world in all its layers, and its layers that are on the corner of that street, and its layers of history and so on, in a way. So I would say that made me feel a bit younger this week, because I remembered that thing where you are younger and you see the world in a certain way, and you don't always keep hold of that. So there's a beautiful invitation in the book for me.
I love that, and that argument against jadedness. Helen Tennyson, we're going to bring us right up to the present day, because Mrs Dalloway has had its London run. It's about to open in Oxford tomorrow, and we very much hope that it'll go on tour and that the entire nation will get to see it live. And you've given us not one but three absolutely fantastic Mrs Dalloways, and we are so incredibly grateful. What was the process of reading and rereading like for you? But also, what are you hearing from the performers, the crew, the audience who are going to be having the same experience?
Well, yes, so rereading to adapt is a whole other thing. And I read, so it starts intuitively. What are the themes that jump out and what are the bits that move me? And you're looking for, how do I communicate this experience of reading? How do I move this into theatrical form so that, what do people experience? What are they feeling? And I wanted that sense of stepping into, a sense of stepping into a book. So when we read, that's quite a private experience, but it's a connecting experience. And so for the performance, the audience are listening on headphones to Mrs Dalloway's internal monologues and to the internal monologues of the characters, because I really wanted the audience to have that experience of being inside Clarissa's head, inside other people's heads. And then externally, the characters are interacting, playing out the scenes. So you're experiencing both those worlds at once. Thematically, I was looking at how do we share all this sort of quite poetic explorations that Virginia Woolf goes on. And hence the three Mrs Dalloways. There's this sense of, Virginia Woolf talks about moments of self, and there's a very strong sense within the novel, and I get so strongly on rereadings. What I got more and more on the rereadings was this sense that Clarissa isn't 100% sure who she is all the time. This sense that she's made up of all these contradictions, as we all are. And that, I think you referred to it earlier, and it was in one of the readings, that she experiences herself as existing in other people and in other places. So part of what I'm trying to communicate with the three Dalloways is that sense that I got from all the rereadings, that who we are as individuals is partly how other people see us, partly something we can't grasp ourselves. We can't completely grasp our identity. So by having 3 Mrs. Dalloways who are amazing and work wonderfully.
Oh, they're so good.
They're the most beautiful ensemble. So they're sort of the same person, but they bring out these different aspects. So I hope that's what the audience experienced too.
I think that is our perfect opportunity to hear from the audience. I love what you say about intimacy and self and community and the inside and the outside, and that we don't know who we are and we don't know how we come across.
Yeah.
So our identity is in part created by what others witness of us, in addition to how we see and think and feel. So we would love to hear from the audience. Hands, let's see some hands before. There's one here, and we have a roving mic. We're going to go straight to you first.
Hello, this is quite personal, so you can make it personal or not. How for each of the 4 of you is it very, very dangerous to live even one day?
I missed that. Can you say that?
Could you
How
say
for
it
each
again?
of us is it very, very
Dangerous to live even one day.
Yeah.
So it might be too personal, but how are you finding it very dangerous currently to live even one day? I think I'm feeling it in politics, and you talked about empire a lot.
We managed to avoid that for an hour and 15 minutes. No, but it's a very very pertinent question, because we were talking earlier about how this was going to be. We would try not to let these issues intrude, but how could they not? That is exactly your point. How could they not?
I mean, it feels like we are at the end of something right now, doesn't it? It feels like we are at the end of the global liberal order. So rereading that scene of the party where the empire has come to an end, where we're reading about the uprisings in Ireland and in India, feels extraordinarily resonant with this moment in time. And the interesting thing to me about Mrs. Dalloway, it's also the interesting thing to me about Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain, which I also a centenary last year, which I was rereading that recently, is that they don't give us answers for what comes next. They merely point to the fact that whatever we have been living through, whatever we have taken for granted as the political structure that makes our governments legible to us, that makes us legible to ourselves as particular kinds of citizens, that is done. And now the challenge is to, one, mourn it appropriately, and that's the point of the elegy, I think, is to mourn something that has passed, and then figure out what rises from the ashes. Go ahead, sorry.
No, I think that's... As for 2 sort of slightly different things, and one is, as you're talking about that and how it relates to the political situation that we are existing in the current moment. When we were actually in rehearsals, we were discussing, we've sort of touched on this, but when you adapt, obviously you can't adapt the whole novel, and what line do you follow? And we very briefly touched on, there's another adaptation that is all about empire and how empire plays out through the novel. And there's a whole lot of political interrogation that you could do in that, and that would be a different version, and that the line that we have followed is much more around the mental health and interior world line, and so that it being very dangerous to live even one day, and probably because of the adaptation that I've been living with for many a month now, many a year now, is. As a sort of, I read it very much as a mental health thing, that to be with oneself in the moment. And yeah, I think I do find, not every day, some days more than others, feels very dangerous to be fully present with myself and everything I am, and how to be and how to interact and be okay with that.
Phelan?
I don't know. I try. I don't know how to answer that really, because it's you'd need to write a novel. but if I took that personally, I would say at the moment, one goes, how does one go on hearing about this thing globally that's happening. How does one live one's little life with your own family and your own children, or if that's your life? It's a bit like, it makes me think of the moment where she's talking about Septimus. And she says, and here I am standing to be at a party. How do I live? And I think the only way I can answer that is to go, if I let it all in, I would be overwhelmed. My only answer as a personal thing, as an artist, is to take the next step, to connect and to keep making art, because I don't know any other answer. I've never known any other answer. I'm lucky. I knew that I would make theatre all my life. I've always known that. So I could despair and throw myself over, but my answer would be to make some theatre, to write something, to make some music, if I could, whatever that is. So for me, the answer to that is art. And on some level, I feel like that book is a version of that. So the answer is, she's got a better answer than me. She's got that beautiful piece of art.
That's a lovely way of putting it. Thank you for that question. And
we have a couple of questions from online, but I also wanted to just comment quickly from the British Library side that we were hoping to be joined by Elaine Showalter. We've been sadly unable to make that connection. We send Elaine our very best and hope to welcome her soon. But in case anyone had the expectation of that, my apologies. We have two great questions from online. The first is from Lauren. On the closing lines of the novel, why do you think Woolf hands over the final perspective on Clarissa to Peter? And then a question from Kate. What do you think Virginia would make of trad wives?
Okay, so we'll do the trad wives question second because it's so great, but let's dispense with Peter first, shall we?
I have thoughts on that.
Go on.
Because we end the play with that line, and so I had to think about it a lot when I thought about staging it. And I think just briefly, I think it relates back to what I was saying further about this sense of self that we're seen from the outside, this sense of we don't fully know ourselves. We have this sense of how we're seen from others. So there is this sense of throughout the novel where there's so much time inside Clarissa's head. Obviously, there's lots of other people's heads, but largely Clarissa's head. And then towards the end of the novel, we seem to move further away from her. Yeah. And I find that very interesting. And it's about seeing her from the outside, I think.
I think that's exactly it. That it's simply about that we got right under her skin and then towards the end we close it. It's not saying that Peter's great and that Clarissa's not great. Merve?
I was thinking I don't know what a trad wife is.
We'll get to it.
I probably need to be on the internet more. For there she was, right? Every word in that is a shifter. There, where, she, who, was what, right? Grammatically, that sentence is designed to pull you into a kind of unreality. And it is in many ways, the Peter-Clarissa relationship is in many ways the most important relationship in that novel. We might want to dispense with him. We might find him irritating. We might find it comical that he sort of stalks a woman around England and then falls asleep on a bench next to a baby because he's a kind of grown baby in a certain way. But the people who we know when we are young, who have seen us for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, who we first read Mrs. Dalloway with when we were 12, don't roll your eyes. Those people know us in a different way. They have all the accreted history of who it is we were, who it is we've become, who it is we are. So it makes perfect sense to me that he gets that last line, or it's focalized from his perspective, because that's the longest relationship in the novel, and that gives it a kind of privilege. A knowingness that perhaps can't be articulated in more precise terms, but that nevertheless has a claim on her and a claim on us.
the tradwives thing is what it sounds like. So it's a kind of neoconservative movement, exactly actually linking in with that first question about instead of having women engage in social and political life, let's just bake cakes and make crochet and serve the men in our lives and stay in the domestic realm. But it's like a whole movement. It's very internet-based, but it's a whole movement around it.
What was the question
What
about
was
it?
the question about it? What would Virginia Woolf
What would she have thought about it?
Trad wives thing?
Ridiculous, probably. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, she'd find it ridiculous.
I mean, you know, well, it's, you know what, I will say, one of the interesting things about her own marriage is that she felt like Leonard took care of her. She was ill and he took care of her. And depending on which biographical accounts you read, for some people that care was unbelievably controlling. And for others, that care was really designed to nurture her as an artist. The truth, as always, is probably somewhere in the middle of those two interpretations. But that seems to me in some ways both the opposite. That seems like the opposite.
Well, he was the trad wife.
He's the trad wife, yeah. Leonard Woolf.
Leonard was
You
the
heard it
trad
here
wife,
first.
yeah.
Leonard Woolf
Leonard
was the
Woolf
OG trad wife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great questions. We would love to, right here. Excellent, thank you.
Thank you very much. Firstly, a compliment on the opera, which I think is absolutely stunning, and I hope to see it again. If I can perhaps play devil's advocate and ask a question to which I know the answer is no. If I look, so playing devil's advocate, if I look around the audience and with respect to the audience, A Century of Mrs Dalloway, is the book now only really relevant to Caucasian, middle-aged and above, reasonably well-heeled women?
Was your last word women?
Women, yes.
Women.
It's women.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I heard that correctly.
Men.
That wasn't a pointed thing. I just really wanted to make sure that I heard that correctly. Yeah.
Well, you briefly, Merve, because I want everyone to answer a little bit.
Yeah.
You do point out that in this novel, and I absolutely feel this too, that Clarissa Dalloway gets this much interior life, and the minions get no interior life.
I mean, there's, you know, in some ways an unsatisfying answer to your question, which is like, who are novels relevant to anymore anyway? It's not just this novel, but any kind of you know, literary fiction, of course, has an increasingly small audience, and that audience is demographically Caucasian, white, middle-class women, right? That is the readership for literature.
And particularly for fiction.
Particularly for fiction, right? So that's unsatisfying because it's kind of sociological and glib. But, you know, what does it mean for a novel to be relevant to anybody? I think what you said about her or both of you said this, about her laying down patterns of what it means to live is so important. To live is to make choices. And then to live is to reflect on the choices that you've made and try to offer some kind of integrated account of who you are based on the choices that you made. That's just basic existentialism. Like, that's for everybody. Oh my God, Elaine's here. I feel like right at the end, we have to get her to say something.
We're going to get her to answer this question.
Well, she can answer this question.
Let's see, Carrie, but I just want to take your point because despite you thinking that the answer to your question would be no, I think that that's not an incorrect read on things. And in fact, it was one of the big criticisms of the entire Bloomsbury group, that if you actually met them, they would be dreadful.
They seemed really fun to me, but
I don't think they seemed
I don't know,
like
who has time for these kind of moralizing critiques anymore? Like, it's just the readership of serious literature is like 20,000 people.
Your
like,
question was who has time for these
right?
moralizing critiques, and that gets us to that first answer, which is, because we're in World War III.
Right,
exactly. Helen, do you want to come in here on this, on the potential criticism that could be made about the readership, but also I think the milieu that Woolf was writing in? It's not an incorrect read, obviously.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's a totally valid criticism, and I think there are elements of it that are true, as already been well articulated. Yeah. And I would add to it that the deeper you get into the book, as we said, there is... The surface is, of course, all about that, all about being a posh middle-class, upper middle-class white woman. And then there are, of course, as with any great work of art, there are some universal human truths about the complexity of existence. And just throw in a little thing that our lovely actor that plays Peter, and in fact all the male roles, and Septimus, he has commented many times on how well he felt Woolf has created the male characters in the novel and how much he gets from it.
I just need to introduce, as we talk into it, Elaine Showalter in the closing moments of a very fabulous...
I'm so sorry. I really wanted to hear this, and we've got a storm here and nothing was working, so... My regret.
We are very, very happy to have you here. We have 8 minutes, and I'm just going to introduce you briefly, and then I'm going to put some questions to you. Joining us via Zoom for this very special event, we have Elaine Showalter, the renowned scholar of women's literature, Professor Emerita at Princeton University, and author of many landmark works, including British women novelists from Bronte to Lessing, including Virginia Woolf, of course, and American women writers from Anne Bradstreet to Annie Proulx. Elaine, what is it about Mrs. Dalloway that keeps us here in a virtually sold-out room talking about her to this day?
Well, I'm so sorry. I mean, that I missed this. It's just, we've got a storm here, very frustrating. And for all of my, experience, I am not a tech person, so was not able to link up until now. Well, I mean, Mrs. Dalloway definitely is the standout of Woolf's novels. And I ask myself the same question, what is it about this book? Because it's not as if the other novels don't have characters that are interesting. They're not that modernist. They're not that abstract. But I think that the questions that Mrs. Dalloway raises about choices that you've made and the kind of life that you're living, the context in which these are so profound and timeless. That people can come to this book and passionately identify with it, no matter what their background or their expectations. That's certainly my experience. I remember I read it for the first time in my second year of college, and when I written about it, that's what I said. I remember that because I wrote about it, and got the worst possible introduction to it from my professor, who said that Virginia Woolf was not as much of an intellectual as James Joyce. Yes, and the only thing that I can say about it was my introduction to feminism. I would not have called myself a feminism at that point, and I just flared up at that and thought there was something wrong with a literary history that doesn't understand the incredible brilliance of Virginia Woolf. So I think that there's a lot more to be said about it. Everyone who comes to it has something new to say.
I want to pick you up on your expertise, which we've just paid tribute to as a historian and as a literary historian, and ask you how critics received Mrs. Dalloway when it came out. Did they loathe it? How long did it take for it to become an acknowledged classic?
Well, there was a big gap. I mean, no, it was quite well received. I mean, Woolf talks, or she writes in the letters, they're waiting for reviews, anxiously waiting for the reviews. The reviews were fine. I mean, they were quite positive, and polite, and they were very interested in her experiments with language. I mean, they understood what she was trying to do, in a way, more than the novel demands. I mean, I think maybe the reviews were so much emphasizing a kind of modernist form and something new that they didn't really talk so much about what was timeless. And there's a great character, the great heroine, central figure of the book, and so many other characters whose problems, something in Septimus Smith, who has character been very important to me over the years, who represented things that had happened to Woolf in her own life, but in such a different context that even people who knew her, I think, would not have necessarily recognized it. I think that it was well received, and then forgotten in a way. There was a long gap between its publication and the time, pretty much in the late 1970s, when it began to be rediscovered and re-entered the canon of people teaching English literature and entered the curriculum in universities and so on. It became one of the books that every educated person had read. But there was this big space in the middle. Can't explain why. I don't know what your thoughts are about that.
We have been celebrating the novel for the past hour in so many different terms because there's so many themes that we could bring out in it. But in the closing minutes that we have, I would love to hear from not you as your public self, but you as your private reader self. And if you would tell us what it is that you love and see and recognize in Mrs. Dalloway, that would be such a pleasure to hear.
Let me get my book up here that I have been holding with all the little tags stuck in it. I always loved about the book that it's about a housewife to begin with. I mean, I think, and I particularly loved the title. There are not that many novels named Mrs. X. It's unusual. I mean, Woolf knew that she wanted it to be about a woman, a married woman, a woman who was not a kind of identifiable feminist heroine of her era, because people were beginning to write feminist novels and choose female characters as the protagonist in a new way. Mrs. Dalloway doesn't come into that category, and it's partly because of that the novel is so moving and so profound. And that the questions she asks herself are so universal and at the same time so feminine. And I think it's that combination that's almost unique, and certainly for her period, for modernism, where there are not that many important women writers, where the great modernist novelists that we think of in the canon are definitely male, and they're definitely come in a very different genre. But Woolf stands on her own and just gets better and better and better, I think, with every year that goes by.
It has been such a pleasure to be here with you, Elaine, and also with all of our panelists celebrating Dalloway Day and the art and craft of Virginia Woolf and Mrs. Dalloway in company with such a fabulous audience. Thank you so much for your questions. Thank you so much to our performers who were amazing.